How many of you have joined us in the past? And so this is the third annual Lessons in IT Leadership. Have some of you been to some of the past sessions? Excellent. So those of you that have not, let me give you a little introduction to what we're going to do. This is the session all about you. So although you're in the customer success track, my goal here is to talk about your own personal success as IT leaders and managers. And we're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about some industry trends, and I'm going to share some personal learnings. And the whole goal of this is to help you and your teams become more impactful and hopefully in the process give you the opportunity to advance your careers. The goals of this session are simultaneously very ambitious and quite modest. And so the ambitious goal is that through some of the observations and insights and suggestions that I'm going to share with you today, you really will be able to advance your own leadership capabilities within the IT profession. The more modest goal is that you walk away with one thing that when you get back to the office later this week or early next week, you can either stop doing, or do more of maybe in the future. Okay, so you're all members of the One Idea Club for the next 45 minutes if you can find one thing to take away from this presentation. Now, as I told the group yesterday, when I tell my wife I'm going to come up to San Francisco and get involved in something like this, her question is, why would they want to listen to you for 45 minutes? And my credentials are shown here. So I am a 7-time CIO. Some of the business partners that I've supported in the past would probably consider me to be a serial offender, but some of my friends in the profession would probably consider me to be a serial masochist. The companies I've worked for in the past are shown in the upper two rows, and I've had the good fortune to work in companies of very different size in a CIO capacity, where we offered a wide variety of products and services to different kind of customers that were located in different parts of the world. And some of the early formative experiences I had at the beginning of my career are shown in the blue stripe on the lower row. Now, some of the observations I'm going to share with you today are based not only on my direct experience, but through conversations I've had with my peers as well. So I've had the good fortune of building a pretty extensive network of folks that have the same responsibilities in other companies, and I've learned as much from them as maybe they've learned from me. There's a personal disclaimer statement at the bottom of this, which is in the fine print, and that is referring to the fact that I would be the first to admit that some of the ideas I'm going to discuss with you today are not necessarily universally applicable. Right? So one thing I've learned is every company has a unique set of politics and personalities and priorities. The business model that you're operating under has probably been optimized for your unique products and for the unique needs of your customers. And then finally, each of your organizations faces certain challenges and opportunities, which are, again, fairly unique to the way you make money. But I think, again, based on my own experience, there's enough commonality in the way IT works across many different companies that most of what we talked about today should resonate with you. What are we going to talk about today? So we're talking about process management. Now, if you've ever spent any time with management consultants, this triumvirate that's shown here is probably very familiar to you. So probably for the last 50 years, management consultants have come in and used like the 3 foundational pillars of people, process, and technology to both measure organizational effectiveness and also to plan business transformation initiatives. So if a company wants to launch off and introduce a new set of products or address a new set of customer demographics, one of the first set of questions they start to ask themselves, whether they use consultants or not, is do we have the right people around here with the skills? Are there new processes we're going to need to develop? And then what are the tools they're going to need to be effective in that capacity? Now, most of the management consultants would tell you that people are the most important part of this 3-legged stool, and it's essential that you find the right people to be able to come in, and that their skills and experience will drive that initiative, whatever it is, or improve the performance of the organization. In many cases, as technologists, we probably, whether we like to admit it or not, we would intuitively believe, well, if we just get the technology right, everything else will fall into place. If there's some kind of super cool new blockbuster tool built on IoT technology or blockchain or machine learning, the technology alone will have such a seismic effect on the business that, yeah, we'll have to introduce some new processes, and it may take some retraining of people, but it'll all fall into place at the end of the day. But whether you like the prioritization of people, process, technology, or you like the prioritization of technology, process, people, everybody has to kind of begrudgingly admit that process is important, both the formulation of it and then the enforcement of it consistently over a period of time. Now, I'm heartened by the fact that we've filled the hall, or come close to filling the hall, because I don't think the topic of process management is one that motivates most IT people to get up in the morning and come racing into work, right? So if we were going to have a meeting today, and I said, gee, we've put out the new draft problem management process to, some of our stakeholders, and then we're going to get back together and mark this document up and, come up with a final version, and that's going to become the new process. I don't think that's the meeting that most people would jump out of bed in the morning and say, I can't wait to get to that meeting today. Or another similar example might be to review SLA performance around other operational practices within IT. And to underscore the ambivalence that most people in IT have about process management, I wanted to share with you a quote by one of our venerable high priests. So Steve Jobs famously said, it's more fun to be a pirate than to be part of the Navy, by which he meant, for those of you that need a translation, it's a lot more fun to be creative, fly by the seat of your pants, make stuff up as you go along, capture victory from the jaws of defeat at the last minute, and then receive accolades for personal heroism from the organization. And probably many people in the audience, including myself, have benefited from a career point of view by doing that occasionally, but it's obviously not a sustained source of success either for your career or for the organization that you're working in. Now, so there's a maybe begrudging acknowledgement that process management is an essential dimension of any organization, certainly in terms of the effectiveness of IT. Now, process management is not some kind of a new fad that's come into fashion, and in fact, over time, the profession has developed a variety of reference models. One of the best known ones is the so-called IT infrastructure libraries, or ITIL. This was originally developed in the late 80s and early 90s. It's now almost like 50 years old, and it's gone through several iterations. The most popular and widely distributed version was published back in 2007. It's known as ITIL v3. A similar one, which you may be familiar with, is COBIT, Control Objectives for IT, and COBIT's gone through several transformations as well. The most recent version, COBIT 5, was published in 2012. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that we need to go back to these reference models and blow them up and start all over from scratch. But what I am going to suggest to you is that as these models were developed over time, they were developed by people that couldn't spell cloud computing, had never heard of DevOps, didn't suffer under the security and regulatory concerns that we have today, and who were transacting business mostly through stationary desktops. I mean, a laptop was a luxury in the eras in which these things were initially developed. So what I think that does beg the question of is how do we adapt these frameworks for the next decade that we're about to enter? And more specifically, in what ways do we need to think about modifying them, optimizing them, tweaking them, that they'll become more relevant to the challenges that we all face within the profession? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, first I want to talk about building processes. I'm hoping many people in the audience have heard about the concept of minimum viable product. Have some of you seen the book by Eric Ries that has been published in the past? You have, yeah. So this is a very popular book in Silicon Valley, and so it's all built around the principle of coaching folks that want to start a company like Okta to initially focus on the most pared down version of a product that actually produces some kind of benefit. And so the key characteristics of an MVP are that it generates enough benefit that somebody will actually use it. Secondly, that the early adopters will continue to use it for some period of time, and that the product itself will provide feedback, user-based feedback, on what the additional features and functions are that would be of most benefit to that embryonic initial group of users. And although the concept has been applied and popularized here for startup companies, it applies equally well to large Fortune 1000 companies or any organization as they go about trying to do things like develop a new mobile application or an e-commerce platform or maybe a partner portal, instead of some kind of a Manhattan project that's going to be over-engineered to try to address every possible requirement or desirement that comes up from the business. People have learned over time, like, let's start simple, get something out there, see how they use it, and then build off of that going forward. Now, what I'm going to do is plagiarize this idea of minimum viable product, and I want to apply it to process and get you all thinking about minimum viable processes. And to start this part of the conversation, I'm going to share with you a story from a past life I had with a former employer. And so I joined an organization, a company that was generating over $10 billion a year in revenue. We had, I think, like 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 employees worldwide. And the COO, I reported to the COO, and she warned me. She said, here's what's going to happen like when you wander around and you start to learn how this company really operates. There are certain functional areas in which we are state of the art. If anything, we may even be at the cutting edge. Like, we are very, very sophisticated in doing certain things. She said that by the same token, you'll go into other functions and you'll think like they're in the dark ages. I mean, they are basically operating with almost, like no organized process whatsoever, or the processes they're using are so rudimentary, you would think you were in like a 200-person company generating $50 million a year. And although I hate to admit it, if we look in the mirror, I think the same observation could probably be readily made about most IT organizations. And people routinely will complain to themselves and their supervisors and their peers and everybody else, like, I can't believe we have all these hoops to jump through to go do something that's fairly routine and simple. And I kind of equally can't believe that, like, this whole other area, we have no process at all. I mean, we're just kind of hoping for the best, and nothing's gone wrong so far, but every time we, through trial and error and seat of the pants, we kind of are able to keep ourselves out of trouble. So it's working. So, like, why would we even want to bother to try to build out some kind of routine procedure or systematic way of doing this in the future? So the minimum viable process, as I've defined it here, is the most pared down version of a process that addresses some kind of a business or operational need within IT that involves the least amount of administrative overhead. And I kind of underscore that word least, because one of the things I've seen happen over time, that when you do find an area where you start to devote organizational time and energy to kind of build out, there's always a tendency to start to embroider these processes to cover edge cases. So every time you think of some new edge case, you kind of add another step or another checkpoint or a little more documentation or something like that. And before you know it, you've kind of created a monster that can get to a point where that administrative overhead actually it offsets whatever the business benefit was, or it certainly compromises the business benefit that's being produced through the process. Hence the graphic that you see there, which is a bonsai gardener with a set of clippers that's like clipping to try to keep things under control. The same thing is true, is definitely relevant when it comes to process management. Now, the key characteristics of a minimum viable process, quite similar to what we saw on the previous slide. It produces some kind of benefit in terms of organizational performance or productivity, not only by the people that are executing the process, but by its business stakeholders, the people that are actually benefiting from whatever it is. It's suited or customized or adapted, whatever verb you like, to the skills and capacity of the IT staff. And then it itself can provide a feedback loop. One of the most popularized aspects of the Agile paradigm is around continuous process improvement or continuous service improvements, where you keep coming back and challenging yourself, whether you've got the right process in place. I want to share with you one other follow-on story from that same company that I referenced before with regard to skills and capacity. So when I arrived at this particular firm, we had a very elaborate project management process. And my predecessor had led a large software engineering team at one of the major airlines in the US, and he had worked on their reservation system. Literally, he had thousands of people that were doing software engineering on this reservation system, and he brought any of those same practices to this firm that I had just joined before. He installed them before he left. And it was kind of a comedy, because if you really looked at the documentation of how we ran projects, there were documents we were supposed to prepare, certain kind of meetings were supposed to happen every so often over the lifetime of the project, and probably more than half of what was written down on paper that we were supposed to be doing never occurred. Documents were not produced, meetings were not held, and it was obvious that, like, this thing was far more elaborate than what we actually needed. So in the first couple of months I was there, we went through some kind of a simplification process, and I thought I had, like pulling weeds in the garden, or I thought I'd like really cleaned this thing out, and we'd gotten down to something that was usable. But we still couldn't do what I thought was a fairly dumbed-down version of what the original set was. We just never found the time. That there wasn't enough staff, and in some cases, like, we didn't have the sophistication. There was a whole dimension of this around risk management that, again, was far too elaborate for our needs. So I went back to the COO, and I said, I kind of declared success too early. I'm going to have to go back, and we're going to have another round of simplification around this project management procedure that we've put in place. She said, well, that doesn't surprise me at all. My predecessor's name was David. She said, when David came in here, he tried to, like, set the table as if we were going to have a state dinner for the Queen of England, and he put out all these utensils and chinaware and glassware and whatever, and he didn't realize that we were just a bunch of hillbillies that didn't know the difference between a spoon and a fork, So, like, this was the table setting we, like, stared at and had no idea what we were supposed to do with this thing. That's what you got left with, so I'm not at all surprised. So the takeaway message here is, as with so many things in IT, it's the Goldilocks solution. Not too hard, not too soft, not too over-engineered, not too simplistic, but kind of at the right balance that it's actually producing some form of benefit and can be used over time to be improved in the future. Now, finding that balance can be very, very difficult. Some things you do today probably need to be simplified. others are probably and obviously in need of some additional sophistication. So for the remainder of the talk, we're going to look into Mark Settle's crystal ball. And remember I said we'd talk about the reference models. And I think 9 of the key processes that we all need to get good at going forward into the 2020s are shown in the crystal ball. At the base, I want to reference some core competencies around managing budgets and vendors and projects, which will always be with us as IT professionals, so I don't want to discount the importance of those. But I think the suspects that you see there in the crystal ball become increasingly important in the world that we are all facing as we go forward. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to talk about all of these today, and I'm only going to concentrate on the 5 that are shown here in blue. And I want you to visualize this as we're going to take a cruise together. And I'm going to be the captain with the cruise boat. We're going to make ports of call at each one of these different topics, and I'm going to share a little bit of personal learning with you. But we don't have time to go into any of these in super great detail. You also note that some of these are not so strange or new, right? I mean, you've seen reference to many of these kind of key operational practices within IT before. But again, my contention is that we need to rethink some of these because of the world that we face going forward. The first is service management. And service management is a pretty broad term that can be used in many different contexts. But here specifically, I'm referring to the way in which IT supports the FTEs in a company, the employees, how it provides the resources and the support that they need to get their jobs done. And the 4 competencies or processes that are so critical there are shown on the left. We have to be able to fulfill their requests, resolve their incidents, do the analysis to understand what the systemic problems are that are giving rise to the incidents, and then put changes into hardware and software systems through some kind of a change management process that resolves those problems. This is the basic blocking and tackling of an IT organization. And your success at doing this will influence the perceptions about IT within 90% of the employees. Now, why do I say 90%? The executives at the top of the hierarchy are having their personal productivity needs met through some kind of a VIP, white gloves, concierge service. And they just sort of assume, well, it's good for me. Everybody else must be okay, right? I mean, if I just call down there, it seems like they're up here like helping me out within 10 minutes, or if my secretary gives them a call, everything gets taken care of in short order. But in fact, that's not always the case. So the other 90% are shaping their perceptions through these service interactions that they have with IT. So I want us to think for a minute about the key elements of those service interactions. And they're shown, hopefully, illustrated here on the left with the stopwatch. So the way I think of it, there's really 3 critical elements in a service interaction. So the first is technical competence. And you've all come to a service desk with some kind of a personal issue, and certainly our customers have as well. Nothing gives an end user a deeper, colder chill than the service agent at the other end of a conversation saying, hey, have you thought about turning it off and just rebooting? And maybe did it go away? Let's try that together. Just have it. So that's like you can just, as the person who spent 5 minutes describing in great detail, how the manifests itself, there's like a sense of, this is not going to be well for me. This is not going to work well for me. Now let's say at the other end of the spectrum, that end user is in contact with or conversing with or interacting with someone who is eminently qualified technically to solve their problem, but that individual displays 0 personal empathy. They're patronizing, aloof, short, condescending. You can blow the whole engagement right there, even though the problem is fundamentally solved, but the end user will walk away from that conversation or interaction thinking that IT is a very poor partner in trying to address their needs. And then the third dimension is represented by the stopwatch. And again, you got to be 3 for 3 in these interactions because you may have the technical competence to solve the problem. You may have been hugely empathetic and conveyed a sense of urgency about the problem. But in the end, it took you a week to do something that probably could have been done in 10 minutes or so. And a lot of that time was frittered away just bouncing the problem around within IT to find somebody that had the technical competence to be able to solve it in the first place, right? So a successful interaction has to score high on all 3 of these dimensions. Now, something's happening in our profession that I think we all need to be very cautious about. So new tools are being introduced to try to automate the resolution of a lot of the incidents and requests that would come in through a normal kind of a service desk. And the classic pairing of technologies that's used in this regard are chatbots, which simulate interactions with human beings to try to get enough information to trigger a series of machine learning algorithms to comb some kind of a knowledge base or database to start offering up knowledge articles, again in more conversational form, so that the user can can self-service themselves and resolve the problem on their own. And this sounds like a great deal from a lot of different ways, right? So it sounds like a great deal because it can lower labor costs. It's basically a deflection tool. So you're trying to deflect tickets or interactions away from, the service desk that you have. But if you think about this for more than a minute, these kind of new technology capabilities could actually compromise all three dimensions of this service interaction that's occurring. So first, the chatbot is never going to be able to evince the same level of personal empathy that a human being would be able to do, A. Second, the knowledge database may not be sufficiently comprehensive to actually have the technical information needed to solve the problem. And if that end user has to go through one of these simulated human interactions for some extended period of time, only to have the automated approach fail and have their issue promoted up to now a new human interaction where they're actually talking to a person, the time element has been destroyed as well because they feel I just wasted 10 minutes playing this game that IT set up for me, which still didn't get my problem solved. Finally, I get to talk to somebody that can actually help me do this. And I think this is pretty obvious, but if you want to debate this, just go to a company that's implemented some kind of a walk-up concierge desk for employee support. They love it. It's not the most productive use of time. If the support staff is remote from the users and they're just taking calls and working through screens and et cetera, they can process more tickets, requests, and incidents per unit time. But when you have that walk-up desk, the interaction alone can do a tremendous amount for IT's credibility. So I don't want to suggest that these kind of new technologies are wholly to be avoided. I wouldn't recommend that at all. And you may have some very simple tier one repetitive issues that crop up across quite a wide spectrum of users, and they would be usually successful at resolving those. But you just want to be very careful about where you draw that line and how you may be compromising some of the elements of that service interaction. What I would actually personally suggest we all keep our eye out for is the use of machine learning to mine the databases of the incidents and requests that are being reported so that we can be more proactive. So let's say we looked in the incident database and we found that users with a certain kind of laptop in a certain geography that work in a certain engineering function seem to have had this kind of recurring set of issues that are popping up. Maybe we can jump on the root cause analysis faster because the ML tools would allow us to detect that trend earlier than we might through just casual inspection. Second topic I want to talk about is application development and maintenance. So one of the things that's changed over time, quite obviously, we've talked about in this conference a lot, is the movement from on-premise applications to SaaS applications. And most organizations at this point are operating in some kind of a hybrid mode. But the essential elements of maintaining a business application portfolio that are shown here pretty much apply to whether you've got a hybrid situation or you're kind of a SaaS-dominated or an on-prem dominated company. There are various types of demand work streams that are shown here on the left involving bug resolution, business enhancements, strategic projects, and then routine administrative tasks that go through some kind of an intake and execution process to deliver changes to the business. That work stream, left to right, horizontal set of activities that you see there are sandwiched between, again, some core competencies within IT. So from a capacity management point of view, IT has to fully understand its bandwidth, so it only signs up for what it can actually deliver. There needs to be some testing to ensure that we have quality control over what we're putting into production systems. And then the change process and the release process itself needs to be pretty systematic and predictable over time. At the same time, the customers want to know the status of their requests, and that's what's displayed there at the top, the SLAs. Now again, I think this is pretty applicable to any kind of a business application portfolio, but what has changed is the introduction of Agile practices into maintaining these portfolios. So don't forget, Agile was really developed for software engineers to build things from scratch. It wasn't really built at the beginning of time to help support an average IT group, support some kind of an ecosystem of a couple hundred business applications. It clearly has its pluses. So it can improve IT productivity. And as human beings, we all know, we can do a lot better job of predicting what we can all accomplish within the next 2 weeks. This is certainly true of me. Than we can 2 months from now or 2 quarters from now. So using the Scrum cycle methodology that's an inherent part of Agile, really makes IT more productive because it delivers on what it can actually get done in the next 2 weeks. Then you may have Scrum cycles of other duration, but you get the point. The short time frame of that cyclicity of that whole process inherently drives more business interaction because the business partners have to be able to help IT prioritize what's going in the next Scrum, and they'll also have to be involved in doing some user testing before the stuff coming out the other end of the Scrum can actually be put into production. So unlike the old days where IT would take a set of work and crawl into the cave and do great stuff and bring it back out again and present it to the end user, now this is a much more continuous conversation than has occurred in the past. Fourth benefit of Agile, it allows and actually encourages a much more consistent and focused effort on tech debt reduction. And so most people that build software products, like at Okta, reserve a certain amount of bandwidth in each one of the Scrum cycles to go in and chip away at some of the technical debt that's been acquired over time. This is super important in a SaaS-dominated portfolio, because the way a lot of tech debt was retired in the past when you had licensed software is that you were on a version of dot level of a release. So you could be on 5.3 of some application. You'd procrastinate for 2 or 3 years. The vendor would have taken it up to level 8.7, and then you'd have this, super painful project to get yourself up to 8.7. But in the course of doing that, you would have retired a significant amount of debt that you had built up over time. You don't have that luxury with SaaS applications. So in the SaaS world, the vendor's turning on new features and functions all the time, and you may start to embroider that with some custom fields or custom objects or some managed application packages that you're bolting on, to augment the functionality that the vendor's providing. And this is sort of your escape valve here, is to make sure you've retained cycles in the Scrum process to be able to chip away at that. And then finally, I think one of the lesser appreciated aspects of Agile is if IT's operating at peak productivity, it gives you a much better basis to go in and argue for headcount. So if I've got 10 people that are supporting a platform like Salesforce.com, I can demonstrate conclusively to my sales and marketing executives the amount of work I can get done, because historically I've got a trend line that we can all follow. Now, if their groups are routinely producing more work for me to get done than historically I've been able to accomplish, either we're going to have these huge prioritization debates about things that really need to get done. So stuff that's going to the backlog is really important from a business point of view. And the only way out of that trap is for us to lock arms hand in hand and go to the CFO and say, hey, I know it's the middle of Q2, but Mark needs some more headcount. And I have been successful at doing this in the past. But you have to metricize the process in such a way that you can actually show that business executive that you are operating at peak productivity. What are the minuses? So IT needs to develop some new muscles about how to take work and digest it and deconstruct it into some bite-sized activities. You kind of think about the schizophrenia under which most of the staff operates every week or every 2 weeks. There's all these, last-minute gotta have requests that come in from the business that seem to trump other activities. And then longer-term projects or enhancement efforts that aren't due over the next couple of weeks consistently get pushed out over some period of time. Very slow progress is being made. So across all those different fronts, with Agile, you really have to start looking at different units of work that can get realistically done in that 2-week or 3-week period. It requires some explicit roles that are kind of implicitly around today, but I think that need to become more explicit. So again, I'm going to take the role of the manager of the Salesforce.com platform. So the platform is useful in and of itself, but its real business utility comes from the fact that in addition to the platform, there are probably 20 or 30 other SaaS applications that are tied to it that collectively enable the core processes within that sales and marketing function. And so as the app support person, it's really that ecosystem of the 20 or 30 plus the platform that has this feature set that the business wants to consume. And so when I think about integrating different tools or making enhancements and customizations, I kind of have to look at that whole ecosystem, that portfolio of features that I'm delivering, and not just think that, oh, this week let's work on this application. Not just take a technology point of view and sort of think about which app at a time am I going to try to go in and make some changes. That in and of itself then begets a couple of other key roles, which is the solution architect, so somebody devoted to understanding the complexity and where changes need to be made. And then finally, a Scrum Master that's going to crack the whip. This is the good cop, bad cop. If I'm the app manager, I'm going to be the good cop, and I need a Scrum Master that's going to go out there and kick butt and make sure that we get done what we said we were going to do. Now, there are some nuances, and the last two comments here are little warning flags about the fact that Agile may not be universally applicable to all those work streams or all platforms. So the third point here underscores the fact that some applications, SaaS tools like Salesforce, they are pretty development intensive. So there's a lot of packages that get self-developed and added onto the platform. And there's some customization that can easily occur when you start to add those ecosystem bolt-ons that I talked about before. So it lends itself, that kind of a platform lends itself pretty naturally to an Agile paradigm. Others like Workday HR is really driven more by configuration changes and less by programming. And so it doesn't really, lend itself as easily to the Agile process. And if you're not careful, there could be some fairly simple configuration changes that if they're put into the whole Scrum planning and scheduling and delivery process, it's overkill. And it actually kind of it stymies the end users because they are wondering, why can't we get this done in shorter periods of time? And the same applies to administrative tasks. And I've learned this the hard way. So you can get a request that'll come in from a function that says, can you generate this report for me today? Or I've got to have this so that we can open up the merit cycle in Botswana land on Thursday morning. We just kind of figured out that we need this today. So all that sounds like a fairly trivial and minor task. To the person in the function, they can't move in their job. Like they got to have this now. And so if you say, okay, well, let's see, we'll put that into the Scrum planning cycle, and if we can wedge that into the next thing, I can maybe give me 3 to 4 weeks, and I think I might be able to get that to you. So that's just a kind of a maybe over-dramatized admonition that you want to be careful about trying to feed the more routine administrative tasks through this kind of a paradigm as well. Okay? Number 3, security culture. Now, it's inconceivable to me that in the year 2019, you haven't all been exposed to the bare bones of what it takes to set up a cybersecurity program. So what are those? The ranking InfoSec official, the CISO, or somebody else will establish a set of policies that are needed to protect the business. Operational controls will be put in place to ensure that the policies are enforced and implemented in practice. The controls beget a series of work rules and procedures that need to be followed. They're instrumental with tools, and then there's some kind of a staff that monitors both the deployment of the tools and the work processes, as well as the adherence to those as well. Now, this is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to creating a security culture. And I've had the good fortune here in the conference to go to a couple sessions where people came from companies that did have a strong security culture, and I visited some myself. So I can't remember what session this was, but there was a gentleman from a wealth management firm, and I've visited some wealth management firms in Manhattan. And believe me, they all understand that if one of their clients, if the investments of one of their clients became public knowledge through a breach, they'd basically be out of business. I mean, they'd all lose their jobs, it'd be over, it'd be done. I visited a gaming company a couple weeks ago in Chicago, and they're very concerned about a breach that would expose the gambling history and gambling information about some of their wealthier clients as well. And they kind of think of that as the existential event that it's like the meteor with all the dinosaurs being gone. If that lands, the business. Like who would go to that casino, right? I mean, if you're reading about it on the front page of the paper, there's lots of other casinos to go to, so that would be a problem. So there is such thing as having a security culture, but in addition to the bare bones framework here of the program, there's really 2 other dimensions that are super important. So one is that the whole business, enterprise-wide, is really educated about cyber-related business risks. Believe me, Sony Pictures now understands who the bad guys are, like if you work at Sony, okay? Like you don't need to go to sack lunch seminars from IT to kind of learn about this. And so that awareness has to be pretty pervasive across the entire company. And then security concerns really need to become an integral part of normal business activities, whether it's the launch of a new project, whether it's a quarterly business review, whether it's the annual budgeting process, whether it's a merger and acquisition. It's a lot, as you all know, all too often these are like a last-minute consideration or something we forgot to talk about, when we went off and put this thing into motion. And that's not right. There really has to be more of a top-of-mind concern. Now, the mistake that most companies make is they assume that there's a small team of people that can protect everybody else. So if we have a 10,000-person organization, we might have 200, 300 people in InfoSec, and those 300 people are going to protect the other 9,700 in the company from doing anything wrong that could compromise the financial viability of the company, which is patently, obviously ridiculous. Having said that, looking within our IT function, we do the same thing all the time. We could have a 400-person IT organization, there's 20 people in InfoSec, and if they should so much as come out of their corner, and ask somebody in data center operations to, patch a server or do something, that represents a security vulnerability, they're looked upon as asking for the moon. What, are you kidding me? I can't, I have so many other things to do, I can't get around to doing that. So the same fallacy that, 200 people can protect 10,000 exists within IT. And I would contend that this is a huge missed opportunity for the IT profession, because we should actually be modeling what a security culture looks like for the rest of the enterprise. They should look it up as role models. Like, this is, man, if I could get like sales to operate like IT, because you guys clearly, like, you think about PII all the time. Like, anybody touches any part of the IT infrastructure, the first question is this related to PII? Do I have a DLP problem if we go around and do something like this? So what I want to encourage you all to do is think about ways in which you can engender that kind of security mentality within your own organizations. And I think there's, to me personally, I think there's 5 key vectors here. So the first, they need to understand, the whole organization needs to understand who the bad guys are. So are you being threatened by hackers that just want to get off on the fact they're going to destroy your brand or impugn your brand in some way and show up on the front page of the newspaper? Are there criminals at work that want to monetize the data that you have in the corporation? Or has some kind of a nation state decided that they can actually harass or embarrass somebody else through compromising you? And people need to understand where those threats are. Equally important, what are the vectors in which they're going to show up? So what are our vulnerabilities? And I strongly encourage you to develop risk registers within the function. So a risk register is nothing more than a prioritized list of these vulnerabilities. And usually, if you've done a good job of curating that list, you use it as a basis for requesting funds. So in the annual budget process, and sometimes the risk registers, not only IT, but across the whole company, might even be reported at a board level. So in the budgeting cycle, we'd say, geez, we've found 20, 30 high priority risks. We have enough funding to attack the top 5. We're going to keep an eye on the other ones for right now, but we can't do everything overnight, but we're going to chase those 5. So it's been my experience that you can go back to the CFO later in the fiscal year and say, I still have those numbers 6, 7, and 8. And in fact, they're not all like big ticket items. There's some things in there that are not as expensive as others. If you've got some money kicking around at the end of the quarter, I can knock off a couple of these things. So you just let me know. And I've seen that work, many, many times. Now, one of the things I would encourage you to think about with the risk register is to involve as large a cross-section of the organization as possible in suggesting items. And so, there may be somebody down in the trenches in the data center that knows that there's a server on the network that we acquired through that acquisition 5 years ago. The operating system hasn't been patched for 4 years. It's just sitting out there. Nobody knows about that but me. And I'm astounded that the people at the top just don't lose sleep every night over the fact that this thing is just out there. I see smiles in the audience. This is not some kind of a news story for a lot of people. But I don't want to talk about gamifying this, although actually I came from the healthcare lunch today. There was an organization where the security administrator, he went to Las Vegas and he got these chips, and he's gotten a picture of himself, and so he's taken pictures of himself and embedded them in the chips. And if you report a risk, you get a chip. And if you collect enough chips, you can turn them in for an Apple iPhone or a TV or something like that. So they've tried to, incentivize people to bring these kind of things forward. And again, this is another great way, obviously, of socializing and getting a lot of people to think about the problem. The same way I mentioned in the previous slide about making security issues a more integral part of day-to-day conversations in a business context, it's true on a one-to-one basis as well. So one of the favorite sayings from a former colleague that I quote incessantly, he used to love to say, "Anything that interests my boss fascinates me." And if you ask even naive questions about security concerns or the movement of PII information or whatever, you'd be surprised how people take cues from your behavior. They want to be ready to answer that question the next time. So they'll start to poke around and be more conscious and aware of that as well. So just talking about these things, measuring is obviously always important. And then I think the dimension of this that we miss the mark on most often, there's an awful lot of information that we have about good behavior on the internet, and it applies equally well to our consumer behaviors after 5 o'clock every night when we go home and buy airplane tickets and trade stock and move investment money around and review pharmaceutical records and look at our student debt. So I think, a lot of times if you have some kind of a security awareness briefing at work, and it's sort of like Big Brother trying to beat into people, this is one more thing we want you to worry about. I think it's far more appealing to say, hey, we want to teach you what you should not be doing at home, and your kids shouldn't be doing this. We want to raise your awareness about every time you punch this and you open this, this is what you're walking into. I'm not saying this doesn't happen today, but I think this is a lever that we really don't take enough advantage of. So again, just to finish this one up, IT should be the role model. Every other function should look within IT and say, we've got security problems in this company. Those guys get it. Like, they're on it. So we got to start emulating their behaviors. Super helpful for the company at large. I think I said I would come back to tech debt. And the background picture that you see in this particular slide is supposed to be a bunch of barnacles. And I don't need to lecture you all about the issues about tech debt. It distracts management attention. It burns up budget dollars. It uses up staff time. It increases operational risks. And I did a little internet surfing to get ready for the talk this week, and I learned a lot about barnacles as I was putting this together. And I was astounded to find out that if there are barnacles on some kind of a transatlantic freighter, you can use up as much as 20 or 30% of the fuel on the freighter just to overcome the drag that's produced by the barnacles. And that's why they're like so hyper-focused on not letting barnacles develop over time. And I thought, gee, that's a pretty good analogy for tech debt within an IT organization, because you can burn a ton of cycles with no net business value or business advancement, just trying to keep the ship afloat and fight your way through the drag that's produced by all these past decisions and legacy situations that you've created over time. Now, some of the steps that I would recommend for your consideration to address debt on a more consistent basis, and we've done this actually at Okta. So I have a gentleman who I refer to as my platform engineer for Salesforce. And Salesforce has been in use at Okta probably for close to all of the 10 years that the company's been afloat. We have probably committed every sin you can imagine with regard to the Salesforce platform. I mean, we have fields and objects that nobody can even remember why they were there. We've had contractors come and go over time that built packages that are still there that nobody asks, But until we actually had this dedicated person and a couple of folks helping, we never really truly appreciated the dimensions of the problem that we had created for ourselves. Just to further illustrate how severe this can be, there's another SaaS company in the East Bay whose CIO I know well, and they've been in business longer than we have, and they're larger. And she put in place a 32-person team for 9 months to clean up their Salesforce Classic instance so they could move on to Lightning. I mean, think about that. 32 people for 9 months to clean up the technical debt on the platform to prepare for Lightning. So you've got to have some kind of a dedicated person who's worried about the hygiene of your core platforms. You really want to leverage Agile to keep chipping away over time. You need to keep score on 2 dimensions, both like what you've done to the applications in terms of number customizations and phantom fields, et cetera, and also the way in which that debt manifests itself to the business users. So page loading times. Salespeople will call in and say, I had to do some homework on Sunday to get ready to tell my boss something on the forecast call on Monday. I thought it'd take 30 minutes. It took me 3 hours. UIT took 3 hours away from my time with my kids because of this. What I had to do in Salesforce was just, incredibly tortuous. And then one of the more root cause things that you can always address is retiring applications. And in a SaaS environment, what happens a lot of times, there's this long tail of SaaS tools that are collected in the organization over time for lots of different reasons. But one of the big drivers is how easy it is for the functional groups to go off and buy stuff on their own. And so you kind of collect all this stuff. And inevitably, there's some overlapping functionality, within that long tail. And you can do one of 2 things. You can ignore it altogether and say, it's not my problem. Or you can try to look at it from more of a portfolio perspective. And although eliminating any one application may not have a huge cost impact, if you start to look at it on a portfolio basis, you can actually achieve some significant savings. And the CFO will be the first person who want to come to your aid and tell you, absolutely, let's work together and go find a way to take some of that stuff away from marketing. Because I don't believe that they really need all that stuff. They can't really use all that stuff. So I did this in one company before, and we called the whole program Get Rid of Old Stuff Sooner. And so we had these buttons made up that said, let's get gross together. And then we went around and we had all these meetings with the functional folks. The last topic I'm going to talk about is IT governance. And the tagline here is aligning IT and the business. This is always, I think Gartner came up with that phrase sometime 40 years ago. And it always gives me a chill because it sort of suggests that IT has an agenda and the business has an agenda. And if we meet at like a negotiation table, we can have a treaty, that we can put in place that maybe they'll let us go do some things in the data center. And in exchange, we'll actually go do some business stuff for them. And maybe we can compromise and find like a middle ground that'll keep everybody happy for a short period of time. Now, the way most of these governance activities, actually occur in practice, there's usually some kind of a committee structure, right, that's formed that meets to try to get IT to meet with its business partners for many different reasons. It could be to approve funding. It could be to provide some form of oversight. Now, I'm going to tell you that I have failed at this more often than I've succeeded. So when I look back on all those companies that we talked about at the beginning, I I don't think I could stand up here and tell you that, I had a batting average of like 80%, and I was able to make this work. But I have had an up-close and personal view of when these kind of committees start to display dysfunctional behaviors. So one of the first early warning signs is meetings are frequently canceled. So you do all this work to get ready for the meeting. One of the top guys can't come from the business, and the message comes out, can you send it out by email? Like, we'll all look at it, and we'll get back to you by email if there's a problem. But just send it out. So that's how we're going to do business going forward. Or you have the meeting, but there's very spotty business participation, or they start to send delegates. And this is another problem. So the delegate typically has no decision-making authority, nor is it their responsibility to go back into the function and socialize any of the information that's being talked about. They'll report to the boss like what happened, but they're not going to go do any, spin cycles like trying to make sure everybody understands what was talked about at the meeting. Agendas become more ad hoc and unpredictable over time, and then the preparation procedures become incredibly onerous, both in terms of the number of charts that are in the presentation deck, which can easily extend over 100, but also in the prep meetings. So let's say there's 5 business execs and 3 initiatives. So by definition, there has to be 15 meetings before the meeting, so they know what we're going to talk about. And they usually don't know enough about what's happening in IT to make that kind of a decision unilaterally. They're going to look at their first lieutenant and say, well, what does Bob think about this? So there's another 15 meetings. So we're going to have 30 meetings in the company to get ready for 60 or 90 minutes of the business executives. I mean, this thing can cascade out of control, which is probably another reason why people dislike the whole meeting structure. Now, I think the recommendations here are too obvious to spend a whole lot of time on. But the purpose of the group really needs to be very clearly defined. Are we going to make decisions here about funding, or are we going to make those decisions somewhere else? If we make them somewhere else, is this the place where we're going to prioritize them? IT can only do so much. It can't keep everybody happy at the same time. Are we going to make the decision somewhere else and just socialize it here? So I was in one company where all the execs were deeply suspicious of each other, and they thought I was cutting deals with the CFO, but they were individually cutting deals with the CFO. So as long as their deal got through, they thought that was good. When they learned that somebody else was going to get an IT project approved, they thought somehow I had gone off and approved it on my own. They're like, this is what IT wanted to do. And then operational oversight, if there's a trust issue with IT, they may want to have meetings to look at like your SLA performance. I mean, they kind of, you don't want to see this happen too often, because sometimes the outsourcers start to show up shortly thereafter because they'll tout their SLA performance and they'll say, I can do a better job than your guys. The scope of these conversations, whether they're going to be strategic or tactical, important to hammer out ahead of time. Participation rules, not only who and at what level, but if we establish a quorum at a meeting and we make decisions, if you're not there, are those going to stand? Like, you got to accept it. Like, if you don't come and you can't delegate and we vote the priority, well, you just got number 3 because you didn't show up. Format and frequency are important, but probably the biggest mistake I've made in the past is not to include some kind of a sunset clause. So let's say you launch a new committee for the fiscal year, and you're going to meet every other month. So you got these 6 meetings. And you put a sunset clause in. You said, we're only signing up for 6 meetings, guys. That's it. That's all the commitment is. So after the 5th meeting, you kind of remind people, we're going to stop doing this next year. So if you've got any benefit out of this at all, we need to reformulate what the benefit was. If you think we're not covering something in the meetings that you want, whatever, but we're just going to recharter this thing 1 year at a time. And we're just not going to let this thing flop around and then watch the dysfunction set in so that we're all just spinning cycles with no real business outcome. I'm going to close with a quote since I started with a quote. The individual shown here is Edwards Deming. I don't know if you're familiar with Deming. He was an industrial engineer and a management consultant that went to Japan after World War II. And I don't know if some of the folks here in the audience are old enough to remember, but the term made in Japan at one time was a very derogatory term. And it referred to products that were going to fall apart and not be useful, within months of being purchased. And so, to his credit, one of the things that Deming did was spend time in Japan and introduce statistical control techniques. And so a lot of the Six Sigma methodologies that we talk about today were initially, preached and evangelized by Deming, and helped Japanese manufacturing reach a level of maturity where it exceeded the prowess of our own American automobile industry back in the 1960s and early 70s. So he was very successful over there. And one of his favorite sayings was, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, then you really don't know what you're doing, which is probably the life of a pirate. I know the pirates have a lot of plans. And then my more favorite quote is this one: a bad process will beat a good person every time. So this is my call to action to you all. You may all be sitting there saying, you know, it makes so much sense what Mark talked about. And he touched on a couple of areas where I know in my heart of hearts, we really should take a look at and we could do a better job at. But, and then the buts start. I got a big project due in Q3. I got to stay focused on that. You know, there's all these other reasons why I can't do that. So if I can't motivate you through sheer logic, I just want to motivate you by reflecting upon the extent to which bad processes compromise the morale, the enthusiasm, and the dedication of your team members. They watch themselves beating their head against the wall, making stuff up, hoping for the best, flying by the seat of their pants. It takes a level of emotional energy away, you know, over time, watching how clumsily, that's probably a nice way of saying it, you know, the organization is actually operating. So just to improve their mental health and bolster their enthusiasm and dedication, you know, I'd strongly suggest you take one idea around the processes that we've talked about and think about them, how they would apply in your organization. I think most of you picked up books, or many of you picked up books on your way out. A lot of the ideas that I've shared with you today are discussed a little more eloquently in the book. And I'm going to add one more comment to the feedback. So I'm working on another book, so any comments that you have, you know, about today might be very thought-provoking for me as well. Thank you very much for your time. I don't think we have time for questions.